Just like any other American, I grew up riding in cars. I have a lot of cute memories of falling asleep in the back seat and waking up in whatever place my family was taking me. I remember when my dad taught me how to use a car jack and how to change a tire. These are all crucial aspects of the American experience. But how did we get here?
In the late 1800s, streets were understood as public spaces where kids could play, people would hitch rides on streetcars, vendors would sell goods and services, and the people tended to enjoy the relative luxury of public engagement. But in 1886, something incredible happened. The automobile was introduced. Finally, people could enjoy the privilege of the horseless carriage, traveling infinite distances with relative luxury. At its introduction, this mode of transit could really only go faster than a slow bike ride, but as time passed, engineers continued to improve the automobile, and eventually a top-of-the-line vehicle was introduced. In 1908, Ford announced the Model T, a new and mass-producible car that could reach speeds up to 45 miles per hour, something that was unheard of at the time.
But something bad began happening. As cars became more popular and prominent on the street, people started crashing.
Without any safety measures in place, mortality rates skyrocketed across America as car owners began riding through the streets without care, largely hitting children as they would run into the road while playing, or the elderly as they tried their hardest to cross the street hastily. People began seeing this and started labeling drivers as joyriders. To understand just how much public sentiment began to sway against the automobile, we need to take a look at some demographics. On release, the Model T was $825, or about $27,700 in today's currency. That was one of the cheapest models on the market. In a freshly post-Civil War America, that kind of money was hard to come by. Many still struggled to put food on the table, and the joy of a car was largely relegated to America's upper class.
Imagine putting yourself in the shoes of an average American. You watch as this fantastic new thing out of your reach is introduced, and then you read in the papers every morning of how many people are dying from it. You probably wouldn't have much sympathy for the drivers causing those deaths, would you?
And car companies recognized this. They understood that the more people who hated the car meant even the people who could afford one might be a little bit more hesitant to have that rage pointed at them. Even worse for them, as America's anger began boiling to a point, some people called for action, and America's leaders proposed something in exchange: a speed governor. Now, for the many who don't know what that is, here's a brief explanation. We use speed limits across America to tell people what speed they can comfortably drive at and punish those who go too far above or below that suggested speed. A speed governor takes this act much more seriously. It is a part mandated by the government that is built into vehicles to limit the highest speed they can even reach. If drivers reach that speed, the part turns off the engine and forces the drivers to a stop. This specific speed governor would have limited speeds to no more than 25 miles per hour. This sent car companies into a frenzy. The cost of their products was far too high to be kept to such small speeds. This would have cut the Model T speeds in half and limited the industry to just a passing fad or a convenient product. They understood that this was rooted in the culture at the time, and in order to save their wallets, this culture would need to change. Car companies, tire companies, oil companies, and everyone who profited off the automobile banded together and established the National Automobile Chamber of Commerce, whose sole purpose was to sway public opinion on the automobile. Through this coalition, these companies were able to establish a free wire service for newspapers, whereby a newspaper company could send in basic details about a recent accident, and writers hired by the coalition would send them back a complete article ready for print by the next day. Many of these papers would shift blame onto the pedestrian, beginning the cultural shift against the pedestrian.
Now, one of the most interesting things they did was revitalize an old term, jay, and they tied it to something called jaywalking.
Jay was a really useful term for that purpose because it was insulting and it was a kind of ridicule.
This is Peter C. Noren, an associate professor at University of Virginia's School of Engineering, but many understand him to be one of today's most important urban historians.
But it was also a specific kind that suggested that you were some kind of ignorant throwback because Jay, we don't really have a good equivalent for that word, but it's something like rube or hick or hayseed. It meant a combination of ignorant and also out of touch with the times. And so if you called somebody a jaywalker, you're saying you're walking like it's still the 19th century, or you're walking like it's still a country town. This is the 20th century. This is the big city. You're out of place. So it was a way of shifting the blame from the driver, who who really got a lot of blame for driving around wherever they wanted to in the city streets, which were for pedestrians, and shifting that to the pedestrian.
One thing that I just wanted to start bringing into is, we have this term that is used as an insult by just drivers, essentially, right? And it's being introduced by car companies through media to kind of like get this into like colloquial use. And I was just wondering, like, kind of, how did car companies, you talk about it in your article, how did car companies motivate the acceptance of jaywalking as a colloquial term? And how did that kind of move it into being like a definite law?
Well, at first, this term, when people heard it, a lot of people were offended by it. It's a little hard for us to understand that because the word jay has really fallen out of usage. It's very old slang. But it meant, stupid idiot. And so it was pretty harsh. In fact, there was a New York Times editorial from 1915 objecting to the term as, quote, opprobrious, meaning very offensive. And it should not be used against, citizens who are merely walking across the street where they want. Now, to get this term into circulation, the people who wanted to promote it, and these were people who wanted cars to have priority, they were very inventive about it. And this was particularly true of the automobile clubs. Now, automobile clubs were clubs that motorists joined because they got certain benefits and services. Most of them ultimately became chapters or members of the American Automobile Association, which we still have today. The American Automobile Association goes back to 1902. And a lot of these clubs were members of AAA from the beginning. Others were independent. In any case, these clubs were particularly inventive about it because they saw their job as protecting drivers from all kinds of problems, including, for example, getting sued for hitting somebody. So to try to shift the responsibility to the pedestrian, they were the biggest promoters of this term, jaywalker. They had a number of inventive techniques for getting the term into circulation. One of the most common and effective was to have little safety campaigns in the city where they would enlist the help of Boy Scouts who would hand out little cards, and the cards would define jaywalking. They'd show typically a diagram of jaywalking. And the Boy Scouts were, they're free labor, so they would be told to hand out these cards to anyone you see crossing the street, except at the crossing. And so people learned about the term by getting these cards often. Some people were annoyed, in one case annoyed enough to deliberately go out to collect as many of those cards as they could possibly get just by crossing wherever they could. But one of the reasons why we know that that's how people learned about it is that newspapers say, this is how people learned what the word means. And by about 1920, the word was in general circulation across the country, but still a very controversial term, with a lot of people really resenting the notion that walking where you want to is anything problematic at all.
Yeah, and you mentioned later in the piece. This comes a little bit past, I think, the 1920s, 1930s mark. But as car companies band together and start using their money like together in order to get this term into usage, you mentioned that they talk about public safety, and so that they'll go into these schools and kind of hit communities where like their children are. And essentially like do things where they go and bring people in and teach children who are a lot less accustomed to like the pedestrian means of like transit because they haven't lived long enough to truly like cement that in their brains. And they set up jaywalking as a term that has like almost been accepted already. And by pretending that it's this thing that has no controversy to a child, they essentially like set up this situation where as those people age, it's almost definite that this term grows in usage.
This is a big part of why over the next generation, the idea that the street is a place for cars really takes off because, as you just explained so clearly, you get them when they're young and people will grow up believing what you taught them. So automobile clubs, especially the American Automobile Association, really took over school safety education in the 1920s. There had been school safety education before that. It was typically more around things like not getting infectious diseases or not getting fires started, being safe in the event of a fire. These were very common things to do in school, but that wasn't a space where the Automobile Association could move in and say, we're going to update the curriculum, and that means traffic safety is going to be our number one issue because that's what's killing the most children. It's really important to remember that this was an era, 100 years ago, when children walked to school overwhelmingly, being large majorities of children, their whole home to school journey was them walking alone or with other children without adult supervision. This was totally normal. So this was a risk, and at first the real onus was on the driver to watch out for these children. But the American Automobile Association and other automobile clubs and other automobile interest groups made sure that children would learn to think of the street as a place they were not supposed to enter except under very certain strict rules like crossing at the crossing. There were safety patrols. School safety patrols existed even in the 19 teens, but the automobile club sort of reinvented them as ways to train children to defer to cars. Early school patrols often stopped the cars for the children. The automobile clubs were more interested in teaching children to yield the right of way to drivers. They still had school safety patrols that would sometimes hold up the traffic, but some of the school safety posters and other materials very explicitly tell children that the street is for automobiles, and that was a radically new idea, and that they have to wait until there's no traffic or they have to cross at a crossing.
And while all this was going on, much of the American public grew unaware and complacent. World War II took hold of the public psyche, and every bit of what Peter Norton discusses here fell into relative obscurity, cementing the actions the automobile companies took here permanently into our culture. As the Allies edged toward victory, future President Eisenhower during his time abroad experienced the immense military advantage that the Autobahn brought both the Americans and Germans. As the invasion began, the Nazis were able to mobilize extremely quickly, but as the Americans pushed forward, their advance to Berlin was expedited by the highway. This experience stuck with him, and once he became president, he began to push for a national highway system. And he got his wish with the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. Cities were now given vast amounts of power and money to retrofit urban environments for the car. Heavily motivated by the influx of subsidies given by the government to cities that built highways, planners across America began the process of demolishing swaths of land, buildings, and historic streets and roadways. From the clouds of construction, our modern highway system arose.
So why does this even matter? Even with this history, we still love our cars. They've become so intertwined with the modern zeitgeist, they basically become intrinsic to the American identity. But like many things, a lot of this falls back to racism.
Much of the land demolished by planners was predominantly owned and rented by people of color. Many were kicked out of their homes as the government labeled their neighborhoods as slums. If their home wasn't outright demolished, highways were built alongside them, plummeting the property values and rooting families even deeper into poverty. This was a part of the greater concept of redlining, where planners labeled black neighborhoods as high risk of investment, coloring their neighborhoods red on planning maps. This motivated banks and lenders to refuse loans to these people in these communities, cutting off profits and destroying nearby amenities via disinvestment. The invention of jaywalking as a crime has also given police increasing power to over-patrol black neighborhoods and continue a cycle of violence that this over-policing propagates. For example, in 2019, 90% of New York City's jaywalking tickets were issued to black and Hispanic people.
Many of these systems were put in place for explicitly racist reasons by racist people in power, and while you may feel that these consequences are long gone or that you may not have to face any of them, especially if you're white, you suffer as well.
Car dependency as a whole is bleeding America dry. Urban design studios like Urban 3 have shown that the return on investment for businesses across America drops significantly when placed further away from urban centers. Small businesses don't have enough draw to make people drive over 15 minutes to visit, but in denser centers, the customer base grows significantly. When considering the logistics of supporting car drivers, you also have to come to realize how inefficient this form of design is. Many department stores, malls, and shopping centers have to use nearly half of their area to support parking lots, few of which are actually used at capacity because they're designed for the few days of the year where parking needs skyrocket.
These systems were put in place at first for profit and then for power. This narcissism in the face of our modern society has motivated an infrastructure that does very little to help the average citizen. When we look at countries in Europe and Scandinavia that have built their cities for their people, we try to avoid the topic by saying that they were built long before us, or that we were built for the car. But the truth is, our cities are a reflection on how much power we give to those in wealth. We have allowed them to shift our very livelihoods, and as a result, we take on extra costs, we lose our communities, and stake our finances on investments that were built to fail. Yes, America was built for cars, but more importantly, it was built for the rich.